Hello and welcome back to another update where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the Kreminna direction where we see that the Russian forces yet again managed to advance slightly here to the west in the direction of Terni and Yampolivka as they continue their offensive operations in this direction and try to gain the advantage with the recent advances they have made. They have allowed to go beyond the first lines of defense of the Ukrainian forces. Therefore, they're trying to take advantage and continue advancing and then consolidate their gains. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces are launching counterattacks, trying to negate these advances and try to prevent the Russians from consolidating their gains. Therefore, we are seeing a lot of positional fighting and a lot of back and forth between the two sides, with the Ukrainian forces advancing here in the north and the Russian forces advancing in the south. All of this as we see the toughest fighting that has taken place during these months. It seems that although the weather is terrible right now, it does seem that it will turn very cold very soon, and therefore we'll likely see that with the weather turning colder and drier, we'll likely see more armored operations during this winter than we did last winter, as this one seems to be much colder than the last one, with a lot more snow, a lot more freezing points, and with a lot less rain, denying the muddy weather that we saw of last year. And talking about the Kreminna direction, we see here to the south of Kreminna in the Serebryansky forest area, we actually see these two photos, which is a comparison between almost a year ago with today, and we can see how much of the forest area that has just disappeared, and most of it is just completely burned down. And this is due to the heavy fighting that has taken place all throughout the front line. We can even see that most of the destruction is exactly where the fighting has taken place. By drawing the front line about what it looks like, we see something like this, and we can see that to the north and to the south of this front line, there's a lot of destruction. And in the areas where the fighting has changed hands a lot, like the areas right here, is where the most destruction has happened. So it is very clear that the front lines are accurate based on the satellite imagery showing the fighting and where it's taking place, especially where it's been very diverse and very back and forth. We can also see that it has been a lot in the favor of the Ukrainians due to the fact that the northern areas closer to Kreminna are more destroyed than the areas closer to Ukrainian positions. And the reason for that is that the Russian forces, after their Kharkiv counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces, they managed to get pushed back all the way to Kreminna, and since then they have had to fight their way back slowly through the forest lines, and every time they advanced a bit, the Ukrainian forces would always counterattack to try and recapture the lost positions. So that is a repeat of what has happened, really. The Russian and Ukrainian forces constantly bombarding each other, and the reason why the front line on the Ukrainian side is so heavily bombarded, that is because of the thermobaric bombs and the heavy artillery fire on the Ukrainian positions all throughout the front. So we're seeing a lot of fighting here by the Serebryansky forest area, and that is why I made a video on it, calling it the hidden meat grinder, because that is simply how many soldiers have been lost in this forest area, yet no one is really talking about it due to the front line not moving a lot here in this section. We then move on to the Avdiivka direction, where we here see that the Russian forces managed to yet again push the Ukrainians out of Stepove and have managed to reach the secondary forest line here to the south of Stepove. So we're seeing that the focus now between the two sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, has switched to infantry during this melting weather. So we're seeing that this is actually shown with the footage we received from the front line, where we have this video here, which is by Deep State Map, which shows a night vision video here by the forest lines here by the railways in the east of Stepove, where a lot of Russian soldiers, it is hard to see due to the quality of the video, but essentially they are down here getting shot at by Ukrainian artillery as they are located through these night vision drones throughout the front line, seeing the infantry in bright white due to the heat-seeking mechanism with the night vision gear, and therefore we see that there's a lot of infantry moving to the forest lines and throughout the forest lines, really, as we see the artillery strikes happening in the first line trying to hit the Russian soldiers. And we also see this from the Russian side, where we have this video here, which shows a Russian soldier and a group of Russian soldiers with an ATGM, and their target isn't a tank. Instead, it is one of the trenches, one of the tunnels here by the Avdiivka direction. So we're actually seeing that the Russian forces are using these ATGM on infantry, and that is clearly due to a lack of armored vehicles in this section. So we're seeing the effects of the weather here with the mud and rain and so on, completely disrupting the movement of armored vehicles by the front line. However, as I said, this is going to change due to the weather becoming much colder, much quicker than it was last year, and therefore we're likely to see winter operations by both sides if this weather continues. And since we're still here by Avdiivka, we can check out this video by a Ukrainian soldier walking through the Avdiivsky coke plant. In this video, we see a Ukrainian soldier walking through the Avdiivsky coke plant on foot, and he records the surrounding areas. We start out seeing just the general area around the Avdiivsky coke plant, but as soon as we start seeing the actual buildings, we see how destroyed the area is due to the heavy shelling throughout Avdiivka. We have to remember that this section of the front line, Avdiivka specifically, has been subject to very heavy fighting since the outbreak of the war in 2014. So with all of this constant fighting happening by Avdiivka, which is very heavily fortified, we see that the Russian forces are trying to gain advancements in the northern section. The southern section has been fairly quiet since the capture of the industrial zone and the residential area here, as the Russian forces are trying to consolidate their gains before moving further into the forest lines, where we'll see a lot of fighting similar to the Serbiansky forest area. However, this area is much smaller, therefore it will likely not last that long, and at the same time we're seeing other operations in other sections, so we'll likely not see a large delegation of Ukrainian forces being sent to this area, as they'll be focused elsewhere. And in this sort of idea, there is going to be a Q&A that I'll be making it a live stream where I answer a bunch of questions. I've made a community post, but you can also just comment down here below if you have any questions. And in that regard, one of the questions was about the losses of both sides, the casualties of both sides. And this speech by Shoigu on the 1st of December, 2 days ago, was very interesting because they say that they have eliminated 125,000 Ukrainian soldiers since the 1st of June, or since the start of the offensive. So this is 125,000 over the past 6 months. Then we have the Ukrainians over that period of time. We have these pictures here. On the 1st of June, it was about 200,000, and now it's about 320,000. So about 120,000 killed on the Russian side since the start of the offensive, or since the 1st of June. So they claim about each other about the same. If we consider the casualty rate to be 1-to-1, then whatever the casualty rate is, it is equal on both sides. Then we have to raise the question, how many soldiers were mobilized on each side? Then we get to a huge complex system of, well, the Russians have 144 million, the Ukrainians have 40 million, of which 10 million already escaped abroad on the first few days. Therefore, they have much less manpower. Therefore, on the long term, the Russians will eventually win. This doesn't count in the political situation. What is the political situation? And for that, we have to look at this article right here, where Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kiev, says Ukraine is turning authoritarian as conflict with Zelensky persists. He talks about how Zelensky has been centralizing power. Centralizing power means gathering all of the different levels of power, whether in the past it was nobility, the church, and so on. Today it is similar. The cut off the Church of Ukraine, most of them, anyone that is considered associated with Moscow. He also cut off the control over other areas. So essentially he's collecting the power to himself as the president of the country. And he's saying, this Klitschko guy, who is the mayor of Kiev, says that the only one that he hasn't managed to centralize power from, the only one who hasn't been able to give all their power to Zelensky, is the mayors of each city. Similar to how the mayor of Kherson at the start essentially just gave up the city to Russia. All of these mayors have their own political perspective. They're looking at the war from their own perspective. They're looking at the situation with their own perspective. They are following the will of their people who elected them, supposedly due to democracy. So with how the different Ukrainian people from different Ukrainian cities are different, therefore these mayors will also have different political goals. So when Zelensky has one idea of how everything should go and everyone else has different ideas, like for example the mayor of Kiev said that since the start of the war, Zelensky has not contacted him, not once. They haven't spoken once. So Zelensky is completely disregarding the will of the mayors, according to Vitaly Klitschko, who is in Kiev with Zelensky. Then how would the other city mayors think, the one of Kharkiv, the one of Dnipro, and so on? So we're seeing how this guy, Klitschko, says at some point will no longer be any different from Russia, where everything depends on the whim of one man. So there is this major political issue in Ukraine, and at the same time there are rumors from insiders, anonymous insiders of the office of the president in Ukraine, saying that Zelensky has gone behind Zelensky's back to negotiate peace with Russia because he doesn't see them as capable of winning this war. And then we have different quotes and interviews, like the interview with Zelensky, where he said that Ukraine and Russia are now at a stalemate. He sees it difficult for Ukraine to continue pushing the Russians, and at the same time he's advocating for building of defense, which there has been no budget allocation of in the Ukrainian budget. And according to these insider sources who are anonymous, therefore we have to keep it as hearsay, that information, they claim that Zelensky is only reluctant to go on the defensive because he wants to continue winning, he wants to continue taking land, he doesn't want to defend because defending is losing in his eyes. And that is when we go back to the other article with the interview with Zelensky himself, saying that no one believes in Ukraine's victory as much as him. But in reality, it may just be that no one is as delusional as him, thinking that they can constantly win, when war is not like that. Any country who has ever won a war has faced some issues. They've faced some points where they had to go on the defensive. It's called strategy. It's called fighting a war. And Zelensky is not a war person. He has no idea what war is, and he has spent none of his life learning about it. He's not done anything regarding to war. He just listens to what people tell him, and people tell him what he wants to know because that is what they gain from. That is a democracy, yet again. So we're seeing that there's these huge issues with the political section of Ukraine. While Russia, it is fairly simple. It's what it has been for the past 20 years under Putin. As long as Putin is in power, he has firmly solidified his own control over the country, which is evident with how there's no real huge political issues despite everything that has happened, despite him starting a war, despite the economic issues and so on. There's been no major movement to do anything against him, and that is due to his firm control over the different aspects of the country. The biggest one was Prigozhin with Wagner, but yet again, they ended up now still returning to fight in the war in Ukraine and mainly operating in Africa. So in the end, nothing really happened, despite him not really having any defense on that day. So we're seeing that despite all of this, the political situation in Ukraine is rapidly deteriorating, and depending on what happens in the coming months, whether Ukraine holds an election, whether, as Klitschko says, Zelensky will continue centralizing power, whether this alleged war between Zelensky and Zelensky will end with what happening. Will Zelensky suddenly do something against Zelensky to make him resign or stop? That could spell issues for the military in Ukraine, as Zelensky is the head of the military. Will Zelensky retire? That would put pressure on what support will actually be sent to Ukraine, because he's been like the man who's getting support for Ukraine. So there's many unanswered issues, and in the end we'll just go into speculation, but the situation is that it is clear that there's huge political issues within Ukraine, and it's not something that can be fixed in a day or two, and it is something that is definitely affecting the war process. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.